great. And it's so, I don't want to say funny, but it's something that when we wrote, we couldn't have envisioned where things would be in 2020. So it was kind of like during the past administration, it was still something that was really fun to talk. Well, you might want to talk about this later.
Yeah.
It was really fun to talk about, but things seemed like they were going on a better trajectory in terms of representation of science folks in the administration. And now it's suddenly like so relevant, if not more relevant than it was when it first came out, which has been interesting as author.
Well, and I was just going to say the book is almost 10 years old or a little bit older, but yeah, exactly. Like it's one of those that I have reread multiple times just over the years because I'm like, this is still relevant. And
some things have changed so much, and then some things feel like they've like in some ways things have gotten better. I think scientist portrayal in media, like in film, has gotten a lot better since we wrote the book, but then political aspect of it feels like feels like kind of just it's really frustrating. So that's cool. So I saw you were talking to Deborah Bloom.
Yes, yeah. She's fabulous.
She's wonderful. Yeah, she's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And so are you, what stage of your career are you at now?
That's a really good question. I'm finishing my master's degree in science communication at Imperial College in London. Although I'm based in Colorado. This is where I'm living. You know, I'm going to stay here. But yeah, so it's just one of those where I really wanted to talk to people, and I had this idea for, you know, a podcast about science books, and I was like, oh, this would be awesome to do. And then I was like, well, why don't I make it a blog to start so people can at least see the book cover, you know, see, you know, my blurb on the book, have a link to, you know, buy the book if they want to buy it, or a link to the author's bio or whatever, and then have the interview afterwards so that they can play it. And
yeah, I think that's really neat. Like, I need to go back and look at your
Sure,
archive.
Go for it. You know, COVID has been one of those interesting things where I've just been kind of lucky where everybody's been stuck at home. So I've been able to interview people that I never thought I would be interviewing, like, you know, Deborah Blum, where I'm like, oh my goodness, you're one of my science writer favorite authors, and you want to talk to me? That's kind of crazy.
She's amazing. And she does make herself so accessible, like, all the time. I mean, I called her earlier this year, like, you know, my kids are running around like crazy in the house, and she's just like super patient and nice, and, like, totally gets it. So
yeah, no, she's great. So yeah, no, it's been really, really nice to have that sort of, in a weird sort of way, that COVID environment to be able to reach out to more people and just talk about science writing. And yeah, the blogcast has gotten quite a following, actually. Quite a few of the authors I've interviewed, I think Deborah was one of them too, actually, have added it to their social medias as far as just, you know, here's this interview I did with this random student. So that's been kind of fun. So yeah, that's where I'm at, and my career is, you know, doing the marketing stuff, but also putzing around and doing whatever I want science-wise. So I'm doing this, and then have a couple other podcasts specifically on scientists, which has been really fun. So
that's great.
Yeah. So I'll turn this one into a podcast eventually, but I'm liking the blog style for now. So you will be on both, I promise.
There it is. You know what? I will just look forward to seeing what you put together. I think it's
perfect.
Really cool.
So yeah, so I do have a few questions about Unscientific America specifically, but clearly, you know, as I said, the book's about 10 years old, so I'm curious what you're working on right now, if you could talk about it, or if you're sworn to secrecy. I'm not entirely sure.
So what I do now, so I'm based at Michigan State University now, and I work on issues that affect food, and usually they're tied to climate change, but more broadly food insecurity. And what's been interesting is I started my career in oceans. So I went to graduate school the first time in oceans, marine science, studied sea cucumbers. Then I worked on Capitol Hill, which got me thinking about a lot of the ideas that translated into Unscientific America, just about this gap between science and people, and the policies we get, and culture. Then I went on to work at Duke, and I was doing ocean policy and environment, but transitioned into energy and water and the environment when I was at Texas. And so now I'm up at Michigan State working on food, and what's really interesting and really encouraging is I'm talking about all the same issues, right? I'm talking about growing numbers of people, limited resources, and a changing planet, and how we're going to make sense of that and hopefully work out the best possible scenario for everyone. to do well, to be able to eat, to be able to live, to be able to prosper ideally. In terms of reaching different audiences, through the lens of food, I'm able to talk to a much wider group of people. It's not as immediately partisan. It's hard to argue that children who are food insecure, I mean, it's hard to argue anything against that, right? Because we all want to take care of our community. And so that's really interesting, this foray into food. At the same time, I've got this PBS digital short series called Serving Up Science, and it's kind of a fun look at how food and science intersect with our lives. So we've done stuff on plant-based meat, and we've done so many fun topics, like what are tannins in your wine, like sort of keeping it light, but keeping it also focused on science in our lives, which is really what a lot of my writing and my work is about. I was also doing a show on our NPR station in Michigan with the same title, Serving Up Science, kind of exploring what are GMOs, what's gene editing. So I've gotten more and more interested in this food space. I'm actually going back to a second graduate program that starts this fall, specifically on community sustainability. So that intersection of food and people and climate change, and how to put those pieces together, in the best possible way. So I'm thinking about a lot of things, and there's some writing coming out of that. So I've been talking to some different people and playing with those ideas quite a bit in the last couple of years.
Sure. No, that sounds amazing. I mean, clearly you're quite busy, but you love it, which is awesome. Do you notice, at least, and I know, in Unscientific America, you talk about conservative audiences and climate change, but I'm curious if you notice anything specifically with GMOs, and maybe not necessarily more conservative audiences, but, the conversation around GMOs has changed within the last few years, and I'm curious if you've noticed a shift or if you've seen anything interesting with that.
I'm curious how you think things have shifted, because I feel like I haven't seen that.
Oh, gotcha. I mean, maybe it's just me, studying in a different country, but I've just noticed that the conversation hasn't been as focused on GMOs, like GMOs were such a big thing, and then the attention kind of died away a little bit. But please correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, so in the European Union, the laws regulating the use of genetically modified foods are more stringent than they are in the United States. But there's a big pushback against the science, and it doesn't fall neatly along partisan lines. So you have people that might be very pro-science on issues like climate change, absolutely kind of ignoring the science, following the popular culture regarding issues related to genetically modified foods. And I think that's because the people that we're turning to for information about what we eat, what's healthy, what's best, what's safe, aren't often the scientists. They're the big influencers, right? So they're Gwyneth Paltrow. They're this woman who goes by the Food Babe, who's somehow super popular. They don't really have the expertise, but they're popular and they have very large followings, and they're often turning people away from the science, which from my perspective is really frustrating, because it's really a bunch of affluent, primarily white influencers telling the rest of us about the future of what we should eat, when food insecurity is such a big challenge that we're headed into in the coming decades. And unless we start adapting and adopting new technologies like GMOs, and I'm not talking about the big, large multinational corporations and what they've done with GMOs. They've definitely been bad actors. But there are some really great scientists working on developing crops that are more tolerant to drought, can survive flooding, that are going to help us be more prepared for the changing environment that we face due to climate change, that we're really not seeing. They don't have the funding, they don't have the support, and they don't have the ability to get in the marketplace like these big companies that are producing like 2 crops that aren't necessarily the ones that we need.
Gotcha, that makes sense. As far as like the social media influencer side goes with GMOs, have you noticed that, like scientists should be posting more on social media to kind of combat that? Or is there any sort of way we can kind of rectify that situation? Or is it more just, this is what's happening right now and, we kind of have to go with it as is?
I think it's really hard, because who are our celebrity scientists? There are not too many. When we wrote Unscientific America, one of the things that we pointed to was the fact that very few Americans could name a scientist, and the ones that did usually picked people like Bill Gates or Al Gore or Albert Einstein. So people who either weren't alive at the time or, aren't really the kinds of scientists that we were talking about in the book. I think that's changed a bit. I think a lot of people might recognize Anthony Fauci or Neil deGrasse Tyson, or a little more wide of a spectrum of people. But I think even those folks, in most cases, don't hold a candle to the celebrity culture that we have that kind of tells us what to eat and how to live. And we've seen it explode in places like Instagram, where people have these lifestyle sites and really have far-reaching influence on what people buy and what we think about not just our food, but our clothing and everything else that goes along with it.
Sure, absolutely. And just kind of as more of a hypothetical question, or maybe just like a bigger picture question is, what can we as like budding scientists, younger generation people, or even just people who are interested in science communication do in that instance of like trying to not combat per se, but just trying to educate ourselves and communicate better with other people about what's really going on?
I think one of the most important things that we can do, honestly, is before we come out with our own message, whether we're speaking to an audience of elementary school students or folks on Capitol Hill, we often don't take the time to listen, especially we might come in with, and I saw this all the time as a staffer on the Hill, scientists would come in with their message and their bullet points and their p-values, but they wouldn't wait for questions from me. And, I'm from the science community. So in my case, I was often trying to figure out what their take home was myself, let alone most staffers they went and talked to that didn't even have a science background. So I think making yourself accessible and available and building relationships, building trust is so, so important. I mean, we're seeing this right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing people not really sure where to turn for answers. They trust their family, they trust their friends, a lot more than they often trust the experts who are the people on TV, or who are maybe not even on TV because they often have the pseudoscience folks on TV. There's just a lack of trust, and building trust might not always be at the national, federal level of we have to change this behavior across the US or around the world. It might be more impactful to work on the people that you already personally know, family, friends, and have honest conversations. Something I do whenever I move to a new town, which has been more often than you might think, I get to know my local state representatives and policymakers. And over time, we get to know each other. They know they can come to me with science questions. And if I don't have the right background for what they're interested in, maybe it's the Flint water crisis here in Michigan, I can point them to the people who do have expertise in that arena, and they trust that I'm pointing them to someone who knows what they're talking about. So I think you asked a big question, but building relationships, taking time to listen, cutting out the jargon where you can, but not dumbing things down. All of these different pieces are important into having an effective message and changing people's attitudes and behaviors.
Sure, absolutely. No, and I think that's awesome what you're doing with the local representatives. I don't think people think that way, or at least scientists don't think that way as much of, I should also get involved with, state representatives or whoever's in my local area, which I find is just something that is really, really cool that you're doing. As far as more just about your book, kind of Unscientific America in general, you talk a lot about the different models that science has been communicated in and that sort of thing. I'm curious, have you noticed that it's changed more recently with things like social media or, political-wise, the Trump administration, anything like that?
I think the answer to that is it depends, right? It depends who you're talking about. So when I was in grad school the first time, around the turn of the millennium, I remember in my little cohort, we had people that would say, I'm in science, so I don't have to do any talks. I just want to work on my research. I don't think it's my responsibility to have to translate any of it. I feel like science communication, science blogging, all these things that are so common now and kind of part of, I think, most people's careers, it just wasn't seen as something necessary or interesting or required the way it is now. I mean, you said you're in a science communication program. I'm 99.9% sure that program didn't exist when I was in grad school. So
Yeah.
I've been involved in consulting at many universities as they've developed courses in science journalism, science communication, environmental communication. So I'm really encouraged seeing the growth of a lot of those opportunities. And I think that younger scientists are coming in with the expectation that they will be more engaged, or at least a lot of them are. That said, I think that social media has compounded many of our problems by creating this network of, do you remember that game Telephone when we
Yes. Yeah.
were
Yeah.
kids? Like something gets misinterpreted in translation, and then that gets misinterpreted, and then by the end you have a completely different message. I think we see so much of that with these short, like, what is it, 280 characters on Twitter that turns into something else, that turns into something else. And the people with the largest audiences and the loudest voices are not often the people that we should be turning to for their expertise on a given issue. So I think while social media has been great at highlighting a more diverse set of voices about science, it's also created a ton of noise and compounded the challenges that we have as science communicators in terms of getting an effective message out that has the traction to really move people. And one of the other things I do in my role at MSU, and I was also doing at Texas, is I have a biannual poll of the American public. It's over 2,000 people. We do it every 6 months. In Texas, I was working on energy and climate issues, and in Michigan, it's mostly food issues. But something that we see is that people don't often know where the experts are on all of these issues. And so when you ask them who they're listening to, they're not pointing to the sources that we would hope that they would. And I think in many, many areas, we're kind of more disconnected from the science and even the issue than we've been before. I mean, the food one to me is more than half of Americans say that they rarely or never think about where their food was grown and how it was produced and its effect on the environment. We see things like this over and over and over. So are we becoming better on science literacy? It kind of depends on what we're talking about when we define science literacy itself.
Sure, absolutely. I was just going to ask you more of kind of a personal question, but also just one that I find that I deal a lot with people is, you know, the reputation that if you're going into science, you have to be smart, or you have to have that kind of, you know, genius level intellect or whatever. And, you know, I've told people multiple times, in my view anyway, anyone can be a scientist. You just have to work hard enough to do it and, you know, have that curiosity and that drive. And I'm curious if you found this at all in your line of work, or if, you know, you've had to combat that reputation that science has in general.
I think all of us are born with a natural curiosity and kind of this, we're born scientists in so many ways, right? Like my 7-year-old asks questions about everything, absorbing information all the time. But when you say you have to be smart, I think that there's not one way to be smart. There's a lot of different ways to be smart, and we all have various strengths. Some people are great with numbers. Some people are great with storytelling. I think that there are so many different ways to be a scientist, not just by field, but by the way we carry out that, we kind of carry out our career. So, I mean, I can say for myself, like, I don't often feel like I fit in the box personally of a scientist, and yet I'm in graduate school for the second time and doing research, and I've been doing research for the past 20 years. But when I'm in a room with scientists, I feel more like the policy wonk, the journalist. But when I'm hanging out with a bunch of journalists, I feel like, okay, like they think I'm the scientist. Same with the people on the Hill and elsewhere. So I guess, yeah, it's kind of a roundabout answer I have, but there's not really one way to be a scientist or one type of person that we should be thinking about in that way. And a lot of it has so much to do with our opportunities growing up, what we're exposed to, who we're influenced by, what we think is both achievable and viable in terms of a career. And something that frustrates me all the time is that when we are training to be scientists in grad school or undergrad, often the main thing that we're told is the trajectory we should be on is toward the tenure track. And I think the tenure track works for a lot of people. My husband's a tenure track professor, associate professor, and he loves what he's doing. He's a great big lab and he's having a ball, but there are so many places we need to apply scientific expertise outside of the ivory towers of academia if we want to change the culture and have influence and make things better and work towards solutions, that we should really be highlighting these opportunities to use the scientific expertise in places outside of universities. And so my hope is with this, the young people kind of coming through the pipeline right now, there are more opportunities and spaces to do that. And social media is helpful because we can point to different kinds of people applying their knowledge in government, in education, in journalism, and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Do you notice with younger people that a younger generation is more science focused or more about science communication as compared to older generations?
I don't know if that's a fair comparison, right? Because
Sure.
if we were little kids when we landed the man on the moon, like, I think there was a great excitement and anticipation about what science could achieve, and how, you know, science built our booming economy, and it's really shaped the United States and made us a global leader, or at least it has up till now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think something that's happened more recently is the type of person that we anticipate as a scientist has shifted. Social media is part of the reason we're seeing that. Portrayals of scientists in the media have changed. Before we wrote Unscientific America, I don't think The Big Bang Theory was out yet. Breaking Bad wasn't out yet. You know, these are popular characters that don't quite look like our are often, you know, the fallback of like the white guy who's like completely disconnected from culture and people and society and awkward and wears glasses. Like, scientists look a lot of different ways, and I think that those different kinds of portrayals of who scientists are and what we do has been really helpful in pushing more people to consider a career in science. And we're seeing that, especially as YouTube videos and channels are kind of exploding with science as part of them, but maybe not the central theme. There's a lot more opportunity, I think, and I think we're moving in the right direction on that one.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm just going to ask you one last question and then I'll let you go because I
Sure.
don't want to take up too much of your day. Although this has been really, really interesting and you know, I love chatting with you. You've got so much going for you as far as just research and your background, of course. But the last question I was just going to ask you is more of kind of as an expert on science communication, or at least one who you know has studied it enough. Have you seen anything as far as the effects of COVID-19 on science communication? Because you know this is very unprecedented for our global society. I'm just curious if you've seen anything, a shift towards the positive, the negative, you know, just within the U.S. or even globally, that sort of thing.
I've been following that pretty closely. We did a panel. The Duke Center for Science and Society did a panel that I was on with some other science communication folks back in, I think, April, late March or April, about how we were communicating around COVID. And I'd say there have been some successes and some real missteps and missed opportunities. I mean, you can talk about the initial response to the coronavirus when there was that really, well, it's pretty easy to understand the flatten the curve graph that everyone saw, right? Like, it was like, if we all stay home and, you know, change our behavior for this period of time, we're going to flatten the curve. And it was a simple message. Everyone kind of saw it and people got it. And initially there was a lot of adherence to this staying home behavior. But I also think it wasn't necessarily communicated in the way it was intended. I think a lot of people thought flatten the curve meant get rid of the virus or no one gets sick. And it wasn't about total numbers of infection. It was about not overwhelming hospitals, which, like, big picture, I don't think a lot of folks understood. So they didn't understand why 4 weeks later, the coronavirus was still around, and what was the point. So just small aspects of this have been really interesting. I think the pushback, the way that the coronavirus has been politicized, and the way that the scientists working on both the research and the communication about it have been targeted in ways that I feel like in some ways is unprecedented. I mean, we've seen some of this before. If you look at different people who were involved in like the 1918 flu pandemic, we've seen similar things before, but I don't feel like we've seen it to the extent that we have this time. with so many death threats and so many people feeling like their political allegiance is tied to how they behave during a pandemic that's killed, what are we at, over 160,000 Americans. And it's really been a failure of leadership. And I think in that regard, we can see how it's so much bigger than the science itself, like the hard science, because we, in our little bubble community, we know what we have to do in terms of changing people's behavior, wearing masks, you name it. But none of that really matters without leadership. And I think we've seen that's what we're lacking right now. And because of that, things have gotten so much worse.